The conference is on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the French Fifth Republic, the constitution that was promulgated on October 4th, 1958, and published in the Journal Officiel the following day, that is to say 60 years ago this afternoon. And the inspiration, in a sense, for having this event really stemmed from the observation that 1958 is not an anniversary that receives a great deal of attention, either scholarly or in popular culture and the kind of memorial rites that surround, for instance, 1968. So we've seen this year, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of 68, a whole bevy of publications, conferences, speeches. There's something about 58 which is a bit, I think, uncomfortable, or which sits oddly in the mainstream narratives of both French political history and the history of post-war Europe. And so this conference, in a way, is an opportunity, I think, to kind of pose the question of why that should be so, and also what legacies, what sort of consequences did this moment, in which the institutional order that continues to prevail in France today was formed, what the kind of sequelae are, so to speak, of that initial conjuncture in 2018. Well, to a degree, and there I think we touch on another theme which will be broached, I hope, in today's panels, which is to say there's some disagreement over when the anniversary, what date that is, ought to be celebrated in inaugurating the Fifth Republic. Conventionally, and we saw this yesterday with the French President Emmanuel Macron, political leaders favor October 4th, that is to say, the day on which the Constitution itself was promulgated. Others favor, for instance, September 28th, the date of the referendum vote, through which the French population, an overwhelming majority of French voters, accepted the constitutional framework. But there are other dates, there are other possibilities, and for some time, for certainly the first decade after the regime change of 58, minority, but a vocal minority, insisted instead upon the date of May 13th, 58. That is to say, the day of settler riot in Algiers and military seizure of power, which precipitated the crisis of the Fourth Republic, France's post-war constitutional order, and brought Charles de Gaulle back to power. And so that episode, I think, is plainly uncomfortable for any sort of political regime which would hope to insist upon the legitimacy and republican legality of its foundation. No. So my book is entitled The Civil War in France, 1958 to 1962. And I do talk about I describe the crisis of May 1958 as a coup d'etat. That said, one thing that I attempt to emphasize in the text is that these concepts, civil war, putsch, pronunciamento, coup d'etat, are deeply polemical, and they were understood as such at the time. That is to say, historical actors, both Gaullists, those in favor of the new regime, and those opposed, in a sense debated, experimented with, and hashed out the meaning of these terms. They were, so to speak, not neutral analytical categories, but weapons in ideological debate. And so what interested me most of all, I think, was the discrepancy between the real violence, rhetorical violence, and popular protest, contestation that surrounded the early years of the Republic. The contrast between that hothouse atmosphere and the kind of pacified or neutralized narrative, creation narrative that comes to enjoy a kind of consensus by the middle of the 1960s, more or less. So what I look at is how it is that this nascent Gaullist republic succeeded in a way in kicking over the traces or obscuring some of the drama and controversy that attended its birth. Yeah, so the historiography of the period, for a long time and to a degree still today, has really been structured by an opposition between a vision of de Gaulle as a kind of providential savior figure, a disinterested man of destiny who sort of arrives to save a dysfunctional alien republic from its inabilities to manage economic modernization, colonial war in Algeria, and a whole host of other challenges. So there's an opposition that's been constructed, I think, between that rather hagiographic image of Le Général and a kind of a dark legend, if you will, or a much more negative portrait of de Gaulle as an arch conspirator who, in a way, with a close circle of accomplices, engineers the events that topple the previous regime and restore him to the head of state. In my book, one of the findings that I present is that, in a sense, it's somewhat striking that the evidence is not really up for debate. That is to say, it's clear that Gaullists, that is to say, veterans of the post-war Gaullist party, the RPF, intimates of the general, were involved in fomenting turmoil in Algiers, in mainland France. They did have a vision of a kind of crisis that would be necessary were de Gaulle to have the opportunity to relaunch, in a sense, his political career. And we have evidence that de Gaulle was in touch with some of the key conspirators at work in Algiers who helped essentially transform, in certain respects, an anti-Gaullist revolt of settlers, colonists, pieds noirs, and elements of the army into a pro-Gaullist movement that would favor his installation as the last président du Conseil of the Fourth Republic. And so the evidence is all there. I think what really strikes one reading the existing literature and accounts from the period is that, above all, it's a kind of matter of interpretation. That is to say, for reasons which are quite obvious, I think partisans of the new head of state and of the regime want to emphasize the formal legality of the transition, which is real. It can't be denied. De Gaulle was, in fact, invested by the French legislature under what could be considered normal conditions. And opponents, rather, instead want to point to equally real elements of illegality and kind of high drama. That is to say, when Parliament actually convenes to vote on the investiture of de Gaulle, it does so under the threat of an immediate landing of airborne troops from Corsica and from Algiers, and in that sense, in a kind of conjuncture that it would be very difficult to characterize as one of normal constitutional legality and democratic norms. So the events are viewed with real alarm on the global stage, and certainly in the United States. The historian here at Columbia, Matthew Connolly, in a magisterial study of the kind of international diplomacy of the Algerian War, has pointed to or offered a description of the May 13th crisis as a kind of anti-American revolt. And there's really some evidence for the fact that those who are most committed to the cause of keeping Algeria French resented greatly the anti-colonial, if you will, turn of American foreign policy in the late 1950s, American meddling in French affairs as it was perceived in dealings with Tunisia and Morocco, former protectorates, which had gained their independence by 58. And so the concerns are real, as they are in other neighboring European countries. So you see, in particular on the left, in West Germany, in Great Britain, talk of de Gaulle as he emerges on the scene as being a kind of apprentice dictator, a fascist even. So you see these concerns very much at the forefront in the turbulent weeks of May 58. What's remarkable, though, I think, is that quite quickly these concerns are sort of alleviated, or they kind of are toned down. You wind up with an image of de Gaulle as perhaps a kind of authoritarian, certainly conservative figure, a general, a Catholic conservative general at the head of France, but someone who, in a way, is not a fascist. Has no designs on establishing a kind of dictatorship of any sort. And for many, certainly for the US government at the time may actually be easier to deal with than his predecessors, that is to say, the serial governments of the Fourth Republic, which were racked by contradiction and, in many respects, kind of unreliable partners.